Are you thirsty for inspiration and curious about the life-changing process of transformation? Welcome to The Transformationist. Whether you already know the transformation you're looking for or you're looking for guidance on the way there, these stories of hope will give you practical tips, plenty of encouragement, and an invitation into real, life-giving transformation, whether you're transforming culture or becoming more yourself. Your story is welcome here. So I usually release a podcast every week, and I've been doing that for a period of 6 or so months, and I'm not one that's usually lost for words. But last Friday, the 15th of March, this hideous event happens in New Zealand, and I find myself usually verbose, really at a loss for words, and not feeling like any of the content I had ready to go was suitable or appropriate, and mainly I just felt too sensitive and raw to even think about talking about anything else. And yet words alone didn't seem enough.
Yeah, and for me it's been difficult to do podcasts because of work commitments over the last few months, but I just couldn't miss the opportunity is a weird word, but I couldn't miss the chance to actually sit down and talk about this with you. And just sort of, it's been a week. It's been a week since it happened, and go over the events that happened. For our New Zealand listeners, obviously, we all know what we're talking about. For our overseas listeners, perhaps you may have missed it, but last Friday, there was a mass shooting at 2 mosques in Christchurch, New Zealand, by a person whose name will not be spoken during this podcast.
Absolutely not.
And, it is horrendous. Tash, how have you been? What was your first impressions? Let's just go right back. Let's just start from the beginning. What was your impressions when you first heard about it, and how did you hear about it?
I heard about it first through a news app alert that arrived on my phone. And so I had that morning had friends from the US arrive into the country. And so we were doing a bit of a tiki tour. I was introducing them to the city. And then all of a sudden this news alert pops up. And of course, the first thing that the first response is there's a little bit of the journalist and the news hound in me that still remains, and so I want to know what's happening. My thoughts are immediately about what's the police response, what is the media response. I'm thinking about friends in the business who are all of a sudden being mobilised, and then I'm actually trying to process what the hell is happening here, partly because I've just got home to New Zealand. That is my safe haven at the bottom of the South Pacific. That is my place where things are safe, despite the fact that we do have a dark underbelly of all sorts of things, and I'm sure we'll talk about that later. But New Zealand is my safe haven that I come home to from places like the United States and the UK, where terrorism is something that's always on people's minds.
Yeah, for me, I was sitting, what was I doing? I was at home relaxing, actually. I had a night the night before, and I was just chilling. And then I got a text message from a friend of mine who said, have you seen the news? There's been a shooting in Christchurch. And at that stage, the number was 8 people who were possibly killed. And for me, that was shocking. But 8 just seemed like, okay, that's what not what I expect, but when you think about mass shootings in the past in New Zealand, single-digit figures is sort of something that, is what we're talking about. But then the numbers climbed.
And they climbed fast. And then it got to possibly 25, possibly 35. And then when the number got to 49, I was just like, fuck, I was just, I found it difficult to really do anything for a long time, for hours. I was just sort of like glued to my phone, looking at YouTube videos of things coming out and all that sort of, not that YouTube video, if you know what I'm saying. Yes, yeah.
We'll get to that. No, just watching news updates on YouTube and news updates wherever I could, just to find out what was going on and try and get a better sense of what was happening. And for the days after, the Saturday and the Sunday after, it was just, wow, motivation was gone. I was just struggling to be motivated to do anything, I had to really sort of focus to be able to have any sort of joy or any sort of activation in my life.
Why do you think that was?
I think it wasn't grief. I don't think grief is the right word, but it was just sort of disbelief. You know, it was a disbelief. Similar thing to you. It's like, this is my safe haven. You know, we have the people. You and I are privileged that we've traveled around the world to work, and when you always come home, you feel a certain weight comes off your shoulders, and you feel a certain warmth, and you feel like this is definitely your home. New Zealand's a wonderful place, and to have something like that happen on that scale, which is, you know, you hear about these sorts of things happening overseas, and even when it happens overseas, it's ridiculous, you know. But to have that happen here, it was just, I just couldn't fathom it. Trying to nut together, trying not to come to any conclusions immediately. You know, I'm someone who believes, I believe that there's two sides to every story, not that I'm justifying anybody's actions here by that. What I mean by that is, I'm trying to work out what were the reasons that this happened. You know, what are the results that are going to come from this? I tried just meditating on it, just thinking about it before I let anger settle in, before I let sadness kick in too much. So yeah, that was kind of an emotional sort of, it was like an emotional concrete where you're just sort of like covered in this goo, and you just can't move, and you want to feel something, but it's just, you just can't get it out. And that's the way I felt for a couple of days after. Yeah, I
had almost the opposite response, and that feeling, I was just feeling everything. The number of times that tears were welling in my eyes, I had to be really careful about how I was consuming the news reports, and then immediately, and perhaps this is the space that I've been in, you know, as part of my own. This is possibly the space I've been in as part of my own journey through spending so much time in a place like the United States, which is, you know, full of implicit and explicit racism. But it's almost impossible in that scenario to not think about, how have I been a participant in this, in the possibility of this even happening in my country? Because you don't want to, and then you don't want to excuse yourself by saying, that was just a madman, you know, that was just, you know, that shouldn't have happened, and the only reason it happened is because that one person was a madman. At the same time, you don't want to become so insular and self-focused that you lose sense or focus on the fact that this happened to, yes, it happened to our community, but it did happen to a very particular segment of our community, and that community, the Muslim community, deserves respect and embrace and support as they deal with the situation in a very, you know, different way. And then I was immediately then overwhelmed by sadness and confusion and frustration at the language that was being used, because I'm about words, and I couldn't fathom for the first few days, even though I do think that Jacinda has, our Prime Minister has executed and conducted herself with such grace and eloquence. I think that, you know, she's really done an amazing job, but I really struggled with the language of they are us, because my immediate reaction to that was visceral, which is just like, stop dividing us, stop making us they and us, stop it, that has to stop. We're one. Even
though their intentions are good, they don't realise that that's actually creating divide, that's actually separating them from us more than anything.
Well, it's continuing this implicit dualism that we have in New Zealand, and that I think we have worldwide, which is the humanity's deeply rooted in categorization as a way of understanding the world. And so we get very quickly to good and bad, them and us, you know. And everything within me wanted to rebel against that. And part of the tragedy for me, I think what I was mourning and what I was grieving is what I have long suspected to be true in our culture and have seen in places, which is that whilst we have come so far, we still have so far to go. And that was the part that was really probably the most devastating to me. One of the curious things for me, I have dear friends in the Muslim community, right? Which is, which I'm sure half of New Zealand is saying, right?
Yeah.
But I do, and those friends were the ones that I struggled to communicate with the most, because I had to figure out or try and walk the line or figure out how to explain that I in no way wanted to appropriate their tragedy, that there was no way that I wanted to appropriate grief for what the Muslim community was experiencing, or layer my own, Pākehā guilt on top of it, or, in the same way that when somebody dies, it ends up being the widow that comforts everybody. You know what I mean? Like, I didn't want to project or make it seem that my Muslim friends somehow had to take responsibility for making me feel better about the situation. And that was confronting to me as well.
Yeah.
Because the very people in my community, in my immediate community, who deserved my words and sympathy, were the very people that I was just like, I have nothing to say. I just have my emotion and my sadness.
Yeah, I didn't. I've got a lot of Muslim friends as well, but it's never been a point of conversation. It's never been, oh, you're Muslim, I'm Christian, or this or that, or anything else, or Buddhist, or whatever they want to be. For me, those types of things have never really come into question. I've never, even sometimes I'm surprised now they say, oh yeah, I've actually got a Muslim background, and I'm like, I had no idea. Cool, Then this is like, recently I've known people for years, I had no idea, but it's just, that is part of their life, and I have no idea. So I've never really thought of people as being different in this country. They have different cultures. Absolutely, we've all got different cultures. But it's never really been which culture's better, or which culture, or even if there's any difference between character or human or the way people are. That's never really come into question for me. So when I see things on Facebook, oh man. Oh, here we go. Okay, so when I see people on Facebook who I believe are very uneducated people who should not have a soapbox to stand on, they mean well. However, I think some people, especially in the first few hours, just started rabbiting some stuff on to try and get some sort of something. I don't know. Anyway, I won't get too angry when I'm talking about this. But anyway, one person gets up and he says all white people need to look at themselves and hold themselves accountable. You all had fingers on the trigger and all this sort of thing. And I just got furious, because I'm like, no, this person did not have anything to do with me, or anything to do with white people, or anything to do with anything like that. He was doing this for himself. He was creating his own identity. He was inventing himself when he did this, when he walks into those rooms and pulls those triggers. He's not representing a majority. He's not representing a minority. He's purely representing himself.
Yeah.
And he wants the world to see him as whatever it is that he's created. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And anyway, so I started seeing this sort of thing on Facebook, and I was just getting so irate, and I was just biting my tongue. I did not reply to them. I did actually reply to that one. I said, I understand what you think you're trying to say, and I would appreciate it if you just relaxed a little, something along those lines, relaxed a little bit, and just reconsider what you're saying before you say it, especially right now. Because I think there was a lot of self-righteous people just trying to throw their 5 cents out immediately, and instead of just stopping and thinking.
Yeah. And I think my reflection in the last few days is that part of our collective grief is that I think what you're saying is really true on one level, that this person, part of our collective grief and horror and anger, why we won't speak his name, why we don't want this to be broadcast or, given any attention, any of that stuff. Yeah. The reason why is because it's not reflective of who we want to be. But I do think the grain of truth that's in what that person said, the grain of truth is that it is there in fragments of our society. And that's what we've been confronted with. And the challenge is, on an individual and personal level, how do we consider our response? How do we consider our behaviour, the ways that we may have implicitly contributed to a collective, culture
Yeah.
and somehow still maintain our own individual, identity. A good friend of mine posted something on. He's New Zealand born Indian. And he posted something on Facebook, his own personal story, where he talked about his experience of racism and never being comfortable to be not being comfortable to be in his own skin, wanting to be white, wanting to be cool, not wanting to be associated with being Indian, and all of the ways in which, even though, it was amazing to see him share his story, and it was so heartfelt, it was so eloquent, it was well spoken, and it was illuminating, because so many of his friends, so many of the people that I have known collectively within that community, within that cluster of friends, responded honestly saying, we had no idea and we're so sorry if anything we ever did contributed to that feeling. And so the question of where does racism come from is that, well, it comes from within us and it comes from outside of us. It's such a, it's this big broad spectrum of variables, and I think that's what's so complicated about figuring out how do we respond to it, because I grew up being conscious of what I would call I would say racism and bigotry in some of my family groups. I remember being told by people much older than me that I was never allowed to bring a brown boy home. I've heard those derogatory things being said my whole life by all manner of people. And the difference, I guess, is when have I chosen to stand up and refute those things, or to say, not here, that's not appropriate. When have I, rolled my eyes, or, kind of complicitly stood by and not had the tough conversation with an uncle or a parent or, somebody that I respect, just because I'm like, I don't want to have that tough conversation. And I think that's the piece of us that's been exposed.
Yeah. There's been an interesting thing going around, again, on Facebook, or certain people saying things that they are like, I am going to expose anybody who says anything racist now, or sexist, or bigoted, or anything along those lines. I am going to chew you out in public. I'm going to do this and do that and do the other thing. I don't agree with that. My thought is, look, some people are brought up through nurture to believe a certain thing. Some people have had experiences that create a rage that makes them believe and think a certain way. Rather than chewing someone out and embarrassing them in public, what's the point in doing that? You could create more anger in that person. You could create a rage which just goes beyond anything that we could possibly imagine. This could have happened to this fellow who did the things on Friday. You know what I mean? It was just something that triggered him, and he went off and did it. My thought process is, and what I would like everyone to do is just, if you hear it or you see it, have a conversation with that person. Just have a nice little yarn. Say, look, bro, listen, let's go and talk about this. That wasn't appropriate. You know what I mean? Pull them aside if you can and just say, let's just calm down. You need to realize how you're making these people feel. What is it that makes you think that? Work out what that is. I know it's a lot of effort, but I think it's absolutely worth it. Yeah.
This reminds me of a conversation that I had with Richie Hardcore. I know he was featured on both our podcasts, but and the conversation that we had was about it wasn't specifically about racism, but it was about sexism and talking about domestic violence, and that we live very much in a world that's polarized, partly I think due to social media social media encourages us to make statements, and it doesn't help us invite people into the conversation. So what we were talking about is, it's that invitation into conversation. It's the invitation into let's not stand 25 feet apart and throw bullets and missiles at each other. Let's try and draw close. And I think, possibly the most hopeful way forward for us as a community is to take the responsibility on our own shoulders of being the one that actually steps closer and steps into the conversation. That's maybe something helpful that we can do, in that process. And I do think we need to start addressing that. And this is the part that breaks my heart, because I've had this conversation and been having this conversation with friends in the US, people of colour, and by colour I mean all spectrum of colour, right? African Americans and South Africans who have found themselves in America, and Asian Americans, and and the conversation there, which is about implicit racism, that actually so much of the foundations of that country are based on the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence that actually contain language that is derogatory and racist. They talk about the savages. They talk about the fact that that the only people who are allowed to vote are white male landowners. Those intentions are actually written into the foundations of that country. And so, of course, it remains part of their culture and something that they will consistently have to fight. And what I am now I was already passionate about it in terms of what I want to bring home or bring to light in our culture here in Aotearoa, but now I'm even more so is I want for us to do away with implicit racism. Let's be done with it. And for me that is about not assuming. This is probably the key thing for me. It's about eliminating the assumption that, for me, who grew up in central, ethnically diverse, very respectful public school, that the way I see our multiculturalism, our biculturalism, is as a gift, and I see it as a total treasure, but I should not assume that everybody else in the country sees it the same way. I shouldn't assume that my beliefs are the beliefs of the generations above me or below me. And I think that we do have to start making some assumptions in the same way that I don't want to say, okay, well, clearly everybody that's lived in a flat in Dunedin is, a terrorist a terrorist waiting to happen. I don't want to say that, but I do want for us to start being explicitly honest with each other about the fact that we are still derogatory. I lived in central Auckland in between and have talked about the fact that I lived in between a Tongan community and a Samoan community that were often having spats with each other.
Yeah.
And so I've, and so now my question is, okay, is there a thread of racism underneath that? Am I making assumptions? Do I judge where I want to live or where I want to hang out, or people that I approach in conversation versus people that I don't? Where is it within my life? Because that's where I have to start in terms of, eradicating it.
Yeah, having gone to a predominantly Polynesian high school, into Wesley College, and that was in the mid-90s, early to mid-90s. And that was a time where there was that strange Tongan versus Samoan versus Fijians weren't. They're just too busy smiling. But there was that weird...
There it is, though. There it is. It's an implicit racial stereotype.
I wasn't stereotyping. Anyway.
But you know what I
know what you're saying. I know
right?
what you mean.
There it is. There it is. And yet, our intention is... Right? And then, because on top of that, you cannot deny, even though you are in fact part Samoan, you cannot deny, and I have an ethnically diverse background too, right? The reality is that not only do we lump these assumptions or these experiences that we have, but then we do, and I think this is a colonial attitude, even though we weren't all colonists, but it's a colonial attitude of assuming that if our intention is good, that it's okay. Well, I didn't mean that. You should know better, so it's okay. I can say whatever I want. Because maybe that's just not the case. Maybe just white people have travelled the world over, just assuming that whatever they think is okay, so long as their intention is good.
Saying, Irish people are nice because they're always drunk, or so on and so forth. It is. Where was I going with that thing before? No, yes. So
you're talking about your high school experience.
For me, it was the hate that was getting to me. It was the unnecessary, unjustifiable hate between the Samoans and the Tongans at the time. I mean, I actually think that it's very, very. I don't think it's around much anymore. But then I'm not really involved with the community very much now. But back then, it was just weird. It was so strange, and to watch them adopt, at the time, gangster, black American gangster culture, Bloods and Crips and all this sort of bullshit. it was just so, I couldn't get my head around it. And I didn't even associate with that as racism at the time. I saw it more as like this weird sort of tribal conflict. And that's the way I see racism now, and more that I think about it. It's tribal. These are tribes of people basing their tribe on a physical difference. Mm-hmm. And they don't understand the other one, and they don't want to understand the other one. And that's where racism comes in. If it's tribal,
isn't it? If it's tribal, and I mean, this is an interesting idea that I haven't explored before, so give me some leeway here. But if it's tribal, then isn't it about identity? Isn't it more about our identity than it is about the other's identity? Because if you're dealing with, let me follow up my logic here. Because if it is tribal, then I think the really big, dirty, dark underbelly. That we need to talk about in New Zealand society is not necessarily racism as much as it is classism. Because because it wouldn't be very hard to extrapolate out and go, okay, well, if the Tongan community and the Samoan community are kind of fighting at odds with each other, and they're having this kind of tribal, tete-a-tete, why is that? It's because there's oppression. Well, why is there oppression? It's because there's classism.
I agree. I see where you're coming from. Yep.
And so that's where I'm like, if is that a question of identity? Is it a question of pride? Like being proud to be who we are, but also feeling safe to be who we are.
Yeah.
And I think that great fear.
Yes.
Is permeating the world now.
Yeah, I think so. The disenfranchised or the less fortunate, they're looking for identity. They're trying to create their own identity. So if you're in a lower class or you're uneducated, then you're easy prey for somebody or a certain type of people who can come along and manipulate you into believing something. I think when you look at things like white nationalism, the people that are doing this stuff, like this fellow the other day, he was of a lower socioeconomic group. He was looking for identity. He found something. He agreed with it. It stimulated his anger. It gave him a purpose. And no matter how wrong it was, he was just convinced that this was his mission. That was what he wanted to do. So the classist thing, I totally agree with what you're saying there. Well,
because if you look at, and despite what we might see in American politics, where certainly there's the murmuring of conversation about where certain, very wealthy supporters of various parties would align on the lines of white nationalism or white supremacy. The reality of what we see in, for example, the situation in Charlottesville, what you see is primarily a lower socioeconomic group of people, and so and what they're instigated and motivated by fear that they will lose position or privilege, fear that they will. And that's if we go, if we talk about the. Because it's almost impossible we can't not talk about immigration in this scenario. So when we talk about immigration, and it's probably still easier for me to talk about immigration in an example that's far away than to talk about it here. But the reality is that we have, on one hand, we have an economy that is screaming out for skilled migrants, and then we have amazingly talented people of other cultures and ethnic backgrounds who are qualified doctors and accountants and lawyers who end up working as, taxi drivers. And so, this is, for me, it does come back to this there is this implicit racism, this implicit classism, which is, okay, so we open our doors and welcome people, whether they're refugees, whether they're coming in through traditional immigration channels, and yet we don't make it possible for them to live and be themselves fully alive, fully, their fully embraced capacity, instead we say, your qualification from Pakistan doesn't work here, or your qualification from Iran doesn't work here, or you know, and I'm like, that's what I want to get to that's what I want to dismantle. I'm like, if we really want to welcome people, let's throw out the welcome mat and let's actually make it possible for people to come here easily and find their ways into the meaningful careers and status and opportunity that they had previously.
Yeah.
Right? Because everything else is just, you know, why would you? Because you then if you can't somehow invite people into the same level of opportunity that their hard fought for education has brought them to anywhere else, then you do push them into lower paid jobs. You push them into, you know, less opportunity to establish independence. And I think it just feeds the machine then of everything else. And that's kind of the, you know, that root of white nationalism that then kind of kicks over as it's like, well, we don't want that. We don't want people to be on equal footing with us. We don't want to lose our footprint. We don't want to lose what we have. And all of a sudden, you know.
Yeah, and that's what was happening in Europe. So Europe had this similar situation with the refugees from Syria, refugees from Africa coming over. And it started off as a colour issue, but then the real issue was actually these people. You've got millions of refugees coming into Europe. You've got Europeans worried more about economical stability. They're worried about housing. They're worried about the jobs going to get taken away. They're worried about all those sorts of things. And then you get these white nationalists coming in, throwing in the colour issue, and then that gives an easy, digestible reason to hate these people.
Oh, it's a soundbite.
Yeah, it's a soundbite. And
it's a soundbite that we've heard before, because it's the same soundbite that drove anti-Semitism in Germany in the 1930s.
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
That was the threat, you know? Somehow the Jewish people are going to be more economically prosperous than you are, and so we should get rid of them all.
Yeah. What do you do?
Well, I just think you have to acknowledge it. Yeah. Like, you have to, for starters, you have to acknowledge it and be honest about the fact that those things exist in New Zealand. I remember growing up when I was a teenager and hearing about neo-Nazi activity in Christchurch. Yes. And I don't want to condemn, you know, a city, but because I've seen swastikas graffitied in all sorts of places up and down our country. But I think there's this motivation to say that we can't ignore that anymore. We can't ignore it and say, oh, look, it's probably not a big deal. It's probably just some stupid kids. You know, it's some poor ideology, but they'll grow out of it, right? Because clearly we can't. Because I don't know how much difference there is between, I know that we've made a big deal about the fact that this person was Australian, you know, and in many respects, you know, I did. And look, and got to be careful here about how we then class ourselves as New Zealanders versus Australians. But, you know, I did with a sigh of relief just go, at least it's not a Kiwi, you know? Because I can't imagine. It was, I cannot imagine how I would have possibly coped with the idea that actually that possibility grew up here. But the reality is, it's possible.
It's absolutely possible.
Because there's not that much difference between Australia and New Zealand in so many respects.
Exactly. As soon as I found out he was Australian, the first thing that went through my head was a lot of people are going to be relieved that he's Australian. But I didn't, for some reason, because I didn't see him, but I heard about it. And it's just New Zealand's so multicultural now, and there are so many first-generation New Zealanders, second-generation New Zealanders. It didn't make any difference to me what country he was born in. I didn't give a shit, you know what I mean? Because he did this thing in my country. I don't care if it was Australian or some dude from Timaru. It was just like, look, this has happened. We need to focus on this. We need to look at our emotional situation now and just comfort each other and talk to each other. But yeah, it was interesting because I did think that. I thought to myself, man, people are going to be relieved that he's Australian, and that's really stupid. It's really weird.
No, and honestly, I know, but it was still my gut reaction. I was just like, oh, thank goodness. Oh, thank goodness, you know. But should we talk about Facebook?
We can talk about Facebook, but actually, no, we can segue into that because I'm just about to mention Egg Boy. Egg Boy. So one shining light in this disgustingly horrible situation. There was an Australian...
Will Connolly is his name.
Will Connolly.
17 years old.
Oh, is that the boy? No, but what was the politician's name?
Oh, I don't want to mention his name either. Fraser Anning.
It's Fraser Anning. So this politician over in Australia says some ridiculously racist remarks hours after the incident occurred, effectively saying it's the Muslims' fault for being here and inciting the violence that this fellow did. And wow was all I had to say. I don't use the word wow often because I think it's silly, but I was just like, I couldn't think of anything else to say except, wow, you're a dick. Anyway, hours after he says this, the young Australian boy walks up to him in public and eggs him.
Yeah.
And then he turns around, the politician turns around, throws a couple of punches, he gets wrestled to the floor, and now that boy is a hero.
He is a hero. What I love about the story is that, and so I'm going to tell you what I love about the story, then I'm going to tell you how I'm conflicted about the story.
Yeah. Yes, I agree. Yep.
But what I love about the story is that a 17-year-old was brave enough to, to make a stand, to just go, no, mate, you're an egg, and I'm going to... and it wasn't overly violent, smashing it on someone's head. It's maybe not, good behaviour, but it's not overly violent. He didn't, so there you go. There I go, making excuses. And I thought it was horrific that he got wrestled to the ground by 3 fully grown men who just looked rabid, in my opinion. But the fundraiser that was started with the intention of raising money so that he can buy more eggs, I just thought was fantastic. Even more impressive, the fact that he's turned around and every penny that's been donated, he's donating actually to the victims of the massacre. So I'm really excited that there is, on one hand, we have this, we have one Australian who's done something really, truly awful, and we have another Australian who's actually standing up against... Yeah. And I think, okay, that's hopeful for me. There's a redemptive scenario. The challenge in that for me is that is that I don't know that he, as much as I love Egg Boy and I love the poster, and I shared with some friends of mine who work in youth ministry, I was just like, these are the kind of young people that we need to be raising.
Are they? Are they really?
Well, people who are prepared to take a stand. Maybe
I agree with that.
People who are prepared to say, hey, no, that's not okay. You need to, right? Because it goes back to what we were talking about before. People who are prepared to lean into the conversation, to walk into the conversation. He perhaps just needed to use his words a little bit more than he used his eggs. But
I don't know. I think that was a very good moment because I just think we all needed a little bit of relief.
We needed a laugh.
Happening. We needed a laugh. And I can't remember if I laughed, but I was just like, kind of like, yeah. You know what I mean? I was like,
totally.
Yeah. And we needed that at that particular point in time.
Yeah.
I also don't agree totally with what that happened, which brings me to Facebook, actually, because I was seeing a lot of people just going out there and just throwing their words around pretty heavily. Just one-liners and shit like that, And on Twitter, Trump comes out and he says, he actually did say something quite nice, even though I don't think he truly believed it.
Yeah,
but he
followed up by something very stupid.
Yeah, but the good thing that he said was, my condolences go to New Zealanders and the victims of Christchurch, so on and so forth, something like that. One of the replies to that from a very prominent New Zealand actress was, fuck off, you cunt. Pretty much. And I'm like, come on, don't do that. You're not going to achieve anything by doing that. Sure, you don't agree with his politics, don't agree with him at all. Yeah. But he said something that was actually constructive. Doesn't matter if you believed it or not. There's no need to get up on a soapbox and throw your words at him like that for all of us to see, because you're just trying to promote yourself, maybe, trying to show how affected you are by this. Just take a moment. There's no need to do that.
Well, it comes back to, can we use social media constructively in these moments? And that is not an appropriate place to direct anger. No. Now I can understand very much as I mentioned, my friends from the US who are here visiting, one of whom works with law enforcement, apologised for the export of white nationalism, kind of saw that there's a place at least felt the responsibility, whether it's true or not, felt that sense of responsibility of, there is a storm of stuff happening that absolutely does have a kind of a foundational cornerstone in the United States, that they felt that enough to say, gosh, we're just really sorry that this has happened here and that it's made it to this part of the world.
Yeah.
However, so maybe there's a loosely tied construct back, but that's not the place. I agree with you 100%. That is not the place to throw anger. That's not the place. That's not where to direct it, because it's not helpful and it doesn't open up a door, and it just, it makes it about what's happening out there as opposed to what we need to do as a community to heal and to be better and to, improve.
It just creates more anger. It creates something for more people to get behind and go, yeah, I agree with you, but they're fist pumping it. Mm-hmm. And that to me is like, no, we should not be doing that right now. Or we shouldn't be doing that ever, I think, unless it's on a sports game or something. But we shouldn't be celebrating anger in any sense. We should be being more constructive with our time, being more educated with our responses, rather than, because getting angry is what these people want. Creating division is what these people want, because they can create a division, and then the side that they agree with, the side that they're on, they can build up more, and you're just going to create, we're never going to heal those wounds. And something that's cool that's been going on since all this happened is New Zealand as a whole has been coming together very constructively,
Oh, phenomenal.
I'm just amazed. I mean, straight away, Jacinda gets up. I didn't vote for her. I'm going to say that right now. I don't know if I will ever vote for her, and it's not because of her. Anyway, politically, I was not on Jacinda's side in the last election. However,
we can depersonalise it. We can say you're not, you weren't a Labour supporter.
I wasn't a Labour supporter.
There we go.
But you got to give credit where credit's due. I am utterly impressed with her. She has been bossing this whole situation, you know, with sincerity and just, wow. I'm amazed. As I said before, I politically didn't agree with her, but my thoughts have changed.
Yeah. See, here's the tears coming again.
I know.
They're sitting there.
I'm sitting there going, don't do it.
No, but it's true. I mean, if you imagine what I cannot fathom how much it will take for her to personally, away from the view of cameras, with her family, process and recover from, just that emotional load that she is carrying. I remember Michelle and Barack Obama after the Sandy Hook elementary school shooting, which I think is probably, in terms of emotional impact, in terms of my own personal response, is probably the only other kind of world event that hits me, and that has hit me in the same sort of a space, partly because of the innocence, partly because of the expectation that in a school or a mosque or a church or a playground, people should be safe. But I cannot imagine how it will be to recover and process. But she has carried herself so well, and I think carried us, and given us. I have not seen a single person pointing fingers at her to say, oh, she should have been doing this, or she got that wrong, or she whatever. And I thought, good.
And that's one of the things I've liked about the way New Zealand has responded. If this was America, no matter who the president's going to be, half of the country is going to be pointing fingers, looking, waiting, anything, and jumping on it. But in New Zealand, you saw her and members of the National Party and everyone just standing together in a moment where it's like, this is not the time for any sort of political divide. This is the time we've got to get together and sort this out.
Yeah. And I think that has been, I mean, for everything I said about classism before, let me turn that around to say, that has been an absolutely unified response in just about every place that I've seen, that New Zealand has been so together. New Zealand has been, I have many friends who are, leaders and ministers of churches up and down the country who I saw their invitation and expression of welcome to invite their Muslim neighbours into using their buildings, into using their sanctuaries to, so that any kind of sense of space to grieve or to mourn or to continue in the foundational rituals of their beliefs, could continue. And I think, well, that's really encouraging to me, because that's kind of like, that's beautiful. But that the outpouring of flowers, the artwork that has emerged, the messages, the money. I mean,
like 4 million they're up to?
No, the total number is up to close to 10 million now from all of the various.
Yeah.
I mean, that didn't happen in the earthquake, and all of that is outside of and on top of the fact that we actually have a government provided assistance that will cover funeral costs and hospital costs and all of those things well into the future. I love the fact that we are having the conversation about granting permanent residency to people who were involved in the massacre that were actually here on temporary work visas. I find myself continually on the verge of tears every time I see a group of students singing or going to pray at a mosque, or the hakas that we have seen from around the world. From every little place that there's a pocket of Kiwis, these incredible remembrance services and the paying of respects and the giving of honour in such a uniquely Kiwi way. I mean, I'll cry at a good haka any day of the week.
Me too.
But these were,
But it's where those hakas are coming from. Like when I was seeing the gangs doing it, normally, obviously we don't. Obviously, there are issues with gangs in our country, but when you see them coming together in a moment of solidarity and doing that sort of thing, you realise that this is affecting everybody, and this is bringing everybody together.
Well, I think, it's hard to deny that many of our gangs, I'll call them social organisations, but they are social organisations that actually display exemplary leadership, and maybe sometimes the activities of those organisations are not necessarily always beneficial, but their values often are founded in brother and sisterhood, in family and whānau, and in honour. And I think that's what we see on display. And I remember seeing it after the earthquakes and after Pike River and a number of those different circumstances where actually sometimes those social organisations are leading the response in terms of compassion and empathy. And I think the offer to stand watch outside the mosques as Friday prayers roll around is something that that speaks to who we are.
There's a lot to be said for community, and there's a lot to be said for clubs and organisations that bring people together to actually discuss and learn and do things with each other, because we live in a society at the moment which is very insular. We live in a society where we don't talk to our neighbours. We live in a society where it's easier just to sit on our phones and text away to people rather than having a meaningful conversation. And I think that's... If we can sort that stuff out, if we can sort that sort of thing out and just bring together people in reality and talk reality instead of spitting and throwing each other behind a keyboard, and as an odd example, you're right, the gangs do have a community that brings them together. Granted, we don't agree with a lot of things they do in some of their politics, but they do something right, and that is a small part that we can chip off and actually learn from. Yeah.
I think that there is an opportunity, and I don't want to... I mean, I'm a sucker for the big movie ending, the rise of the hero, the changing of the world type scenario. But I do think there's an opportunity here for New Zealand. I feel like we're already responding differently. We have responded differently in so many circumstances. If you consider that, that we were the first country in the world to grant women the vote. There are so many circumstances. The nuclear-free stance that we've taken. I would even argue, even though I don't think we've got it right, and I don't think that we're done. I think there's so much further to go. But I would argue that the work that we have done in race relations around treaty reparations and settling treaty claims and trying to at least find a positive way to move forward. I think we've at least through recent history shown that we can be a country of people that try that we try to do it better. We try and learn from our mistakes. We try and figure our way forward. And so my hope is that our response to this will be another one of those circumstances. And I do, we've already disappeared. This is a friend of mine sent me a message from Oregon a couple of days ago and said, New Zealand's disappeared off the newsreel here. It's already done. And in some respects I think, well, that's what a shame. And in other respects I think, okay, that's fine. We'll get on with the business of grieving and healing. We'll get on with the business of dealing with the perpetrator of the crime. But my hope is that in years to come, people can look back on this and say, wow, New Zealand really did, whatever shit we had left to sort out, we sorted it out at this point. We dealt with the pieces of racism that we hadn't wanted to deal with. We dealt with the classism that we hadn't quite acknowledged. We got rid of, the right wing, the uber rich right wing people from our opinion columns, or we at least held ourselves to a higher standard of what we considered newsworthy and printable. That's my hope.
Yeah. I think we get rid of some of the overly opinionated far left-wing people as well, just quietly, but that's me.
Look, I think that's true, but the reality is that pendulum swings are required to affect cultural change.
Yes.
This is the part that I think, as much as I'm proud of the fact that we as a country are relatively centrist in our politics,
yes,
it's very difficult to affect change from the middle. It's really hard.
Yeah, no, true.
That's why the rudder's at the back of the ship, right? It's you have to move from one piece to the other to create that momentum. And so, I'm prepared to go. And I'm not 100% convinced, I will tell you this honestly, I am not prepared to make a carte blanche statement or categorization that racism belongs on the side of the right, because I don't believe that that's true. I think that there's just as much racism over in the socialist side of things as well.
Yeah.
I don't think that racism is driven by money as much as classism is. No. So I'd give you an argument for classism over the way of the capitalist. But effectively what I'm trying to say is that I don't mind if we have to, if being a little bit too far to the right or the left of racism and classism means that we have to go a little bit further to the other side, and maybe we do have to get a little bit more politically correct so that we actually hold ourselves to a higher standard and come back to a middle that is elevated from where we've been, then I'm okay with that.
Yeah, the danger with getting too politically correct, though, and this is something that I think has been happening in the States, is that you start to try to control people too much. You're trying to control people's behavior too much, and you're going to get kickback on that.
It has to be internal. So the position that we choose has to be based out of our internal action and not about external. So I'm actually far less interested in controlling or determining how you speak and behave. We can sit here and have a good old banter backwards and forwards. We're really going pretty easy on each other today. But I think we're all just a bit sensitive. But we can have a good banter, and I can be comfortable with hearing you out and then engaging you in what you think from my view on it. And that's where we've got to get to, right? So the political correctness, which is trying to monitor the tone of the whole conversation, that's never going to help us, right? Because that's just more, this is right, this is wrong. So again, it comes back to that whole thing of I need to personally take responsibility for actually being more maybe it's not politically correct, maybe that's not the right phrase, maybe the personal responsibility I need to take is I'm going to be explicit in the fact that I believe that we are one, in the fact that I believe all people are equal, in the fact that I'm interested to learn about other cultures and other people.
We should be encouraging fascination in other cultures, not pulling it apart.
Why is it that we're okay to visit other parts of the world when we go on holiday, and yet as a nation, so much of the world is already here. So many of those cultures are already here. I have loved when I finally got to the point of being able to say something, to one of my closest Muslim friends. He's actually Pakeha, who converted to Islam. When I finally kind of came up with the words, what I had to say was, I want to thank you and express my care and my appreciation of the Islam faith that you have shown me. and for the things that I've been invited into. I've been invited into, the breaking of the Ramadan feast. I've had the opportunity to attend prayers, to attend a wedding, to be part of those rituals. And so I've got to see the beauty of a culture and to learn to understand it through real people, as opposed to ideology. And that was what I ended up saying, because that was really that was the most genuine thing, that I could say. And I think, the more that we can encourage people to actually realise that the world is here and it's ours for exploration. And,
the world's on the other side of the fence of your house sometimes, and we wouldn't know because we're not even, saying hello. But you're right. There was, I was driving down Aniwai Road yesterday, and I was a bit shocked. I turned the corner and there were two cops packing some serious heat, just standing on the side of the road. And I was like, what, why? I wanted to get my phone out, but I was driving, but I just wanted to take a photo. Turns out there's a mosque.
Yeah.
On it. I had no idea. So I did not know that existed, and they were just standing guard. But yeah, I thought it was for the school actually down the road. I thought, they're just protecting in case something happens at a school. But no, there's a mosque there. I had no idea. So you're absolutely right. It's all around us, you know what I mean? You just have to walk from one end of Queen Street to the other end of Queen Street, and you've passed about 200 different nationalities or cultures or anything, or languages, This is true. I've walked from Upper Queen Street to Lower Queen Street, a distance of, let's say, 800 metres, and I haven't heard a single word of English. And the streets have been crowded, and I love it. I think it's cool. I think it's really, really, really cool. And I'm fascinated. I have a curiosity about these things. Maybe I'm fortunate enough to have, like yourself, we've got a multicultural ethnicity built into our bloodlines, where it's just like, I'm just more fascinated and curious. I want to know your bloodline. I want to know how this works. Nothing to do with class or anything along those lines. I would just love it if we just all thought along those lines and just viewed each other with a curiosity rather than some sort of, threat.
I have used this quote before, but it's one of my favourites. It is in fact one of and seeing as the motivation for this attack was religious, I feel really comfortable using it. It was Albert Einstein who said, "Never lose a holy curiosity." His belief that curiosity is in fact holy. It's a sacred activity. It's a sacred practice. I think curiosity can save the world. If we actually just were prepared to ask each other, tell me more about that, instead of being so quick to say, hey, this is what I think about it. Tough work for people like you and I, so opinionated about so many things.
It's neat though when you're curious about things and you get involved with it. Like when you travel, I've been fortunate enough to go to Africa a couple of times and India a couple of times, and I can just stand there and watch, and that would be enough for me. I think this is fascinating, but I want to get involved. You want to put I was going to call them lays, but that's a Pacific. They have their version of the lei, which goes around the neck, and you come and you break bread, and you eat their ways. You eat the traditional way that they eat. You eat the foods that they eat, and all that sort of stuff. Man, it's so enriching, And you just people need to experience that more. And you're absolutely right in the fact that you don't need to travel overseas to experience that, and everybody should be able to just go up to a mosque or get to know your ethnically different neighbours and get involved with, breaking their bread and eating their food, and you should be returning that favour. Yeah. You know what I mean? And having open, warm discussions about politics and about culture and about the way you do things and see things.
Yeah, at the risk of repeating myself, but I find that these themes just come back and come back and come back, and so they become the principles that I'm trying to live to, which is, leaning into conversation and inviting people into conversation. And the second is this, I love what you talk about in terms of sitting down and breaking bread and sharing a meal. And more, and I say this a lot when it comes to talking with men about how to engage with women and understanding sexism or dismantling that, the thing that I say is stop worrying about trying to invite more women to the boardroom table. Just ask for an invitation to our table. because we're already over here having meetings and conversations. And so, why does it have to be about us joining your table? Just ask for an invitation to ours. And that for me, I think, is motivating as well, right? To go, okay, yeah, actually, maybe it's not about us asking our ethnically diverse neighbours around to our place for dinner and expecting that they should be able to dive into a Kiwi barbecue or, a traditional roast lamb. But actually, maybe it's about asking, hey, can I come for dinner? And, what can I bring to contribute to your world, as opposed to this assumption that because we've been here longer, certainly not first, but because we've been here longer, that perhaps our way is the right way, or that our way takes precedence. Because we are all immigrants here, and that is a story the world over, apart from maybe 2 or 3 places in the world, and those places are hotly fought over and contested.
Yes, they are. Going forward, there's a lot of talk about what should happen to said person. What are your thoughts on that? Duncan Gardner said something this morning which I hotly disagree with. He believes that the trial and all that should be televised. We should all see what happens, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. I think the exact opposite. I want that man to walk into a courtroom with a judge, 2 unfortunate lawyers, and a jury, and that's it. The demoralisation he would feel by walking into a room with no one to play to, no one to act up to, would be the beginning of the end for him, mentally, emotionally, and I think he would be on his way to the sentence which I think he deserves, which is almost complete ignoring of him for the rest of his life.
Yeah, look, I'll be honest. I'm really fascinated to understand. I will be really fascinated to understand any of the psychological tests or reports that are made public. I'm curious as to the level or the degree of narcissism that might be threaded into his behaviour. I don't know how I feel about it being televised. I definitely agree with you when it comes to the attention. I'm glad that he's not getting any newspaper coverage, in terms of that he doesn't have the opportunity to see any of this. And I agree. I thought Jerry Brownlee actually said it really well. Where he suggested that a life sentence without parole for every life that was taken, and that sentence to be spent in absolute isolation, with the exception of being played the call to prayer, 5 times a day.
So good.
Which we can. It really was pretty good. I was like, that was nice. That was nicely said, Mr. Brownlee. But I think isolation, absolutely. I don't know how I feel about deportation. There's part of me that wants him to, not be here. But the minute that we deport him, even if we convict him here, the minute that he's, he won't. Yeah, deportation would either have to happen prior to him actually being taken to trial here, or he would have to serve a sentence. I do think that this raises a number of questions about the structures that we have in our sentencing to even deal with a situation like this. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know what I think about it being televised. I feel a little bit uncomfortable about that. But then I also, partly I would want to ask the victims' families and the Muslim community, how they feel and what they, and I'm sure that there's a diversity of opinion around that. Yeah. I would imagine that for right now that they're probably not even thinking about it. No. No. But yeah, I think and also where to from here. I think outside of what happens with that, I think fundamentally, I hope that the way that New Zealanders engage with, but not just New Zealanders at an individual level, but the way that New Zealand businesses engage with Facebook and
saw something
YouTube.
About that this morning.
Because I think that they are. Louise Wallace actually spoke this. She spoke so eloquently. I miss her journalism. Actually, I think she was a great journalist, and she said it really well. I will do injustice to her words, but she essentially spoke about the fact that those publishers of content, that yes, they're platforms, but they are in fact publishers of content. The fact that content is published on those platforms means that they have an inherent responsibility in what the distribution of that content is. And I do think that it will change our relationship with those organisations and global businesses until there can be some sort of guarantee. I think that they should shut live streaming down.
I totally agree.
I think that they need to. I've seen a number of hideous pieces of content showing stills from the video, showing his face, and I've reported them all. And the reports have come back from Facebook, this doesn't actually violate our standards. And I said, and that for me is really it's very infuriating, because I don't think that his face or his words, and nor should any of those acts of violence be captured in any way, whether it's purporting to be a news report or a news video. Absolutely not. And particularly when it's then a news video that's actually been created by a website that's already renowned for trying to instill anger or hate mongering or that kind of racial hate speech. So I've reported a lot of them and blocked a lot of them. The other piece that I think it's really illuminated for me with Facebook is simply how many people, and I think it is generational, but how many people are still buying into really poor sources of information, talking about because so one of the pieces in particular. So there was also a really awful. There were 120 Christians who were killed by. Yeah, it was, but the whole, and so a lot of people were republishing this article, which was in Breitbart, which is generally speaking, is a pretty terrible source of information. If it comes from Breitbart or InfoWars, then really you should not be paying attention to it without a pretty big grain of salt. Or at least some counter research. But the number of people who were publishing it and then saying things like, "Oh, isn't it strange that this isn't getting any publicity? Isn't it strange that this?" And the reality is that it's very difficult to convince people in the world of social media. But actually, what I would want to say is, actually, no, it's really not, because that particular incident is not an isolated incident of terror. That is a resource war that has been going on for centuries and is continuing to go on. And actually, if you go back 6 weeks ago, it was the Christians that were murdering the Muslims. So it's a back and forth that's been going on for a long time. It's got nothing to do with racial lines. It's got nothing to do with ethnicity or faith. It has everything to do with farmers fighting for land. And obviously illustrates a much larger problem. What I've been more disturbed by, is how little attention has been given to the absolute horror of a natural disaster that's happened in Mozambique and Malawi.
I saw that.
That is because I know that we are in grieving and I know that we are in mourning as a country, but I don't want for us to stop being who we are as people who are genuinely concerned and compassionate for the rest of the world. So I think that's my fear is that I do not want this to allow us to become introspective.
That article you're talking about the Christians being killed, I had a similar sort of thought actually, along the lines of this is a completely different reason. This is, they say, land wars and whatnot, and they're using religion as an excuse to get in there and do what they're doing, whereas what happened in Christchurch was just one man's hate against people of different colour, different religion, doing their thing peacefully. You know what I mean? There's absolutely no excuse for what that guy did except for his own, as I said, his own purposes. And what he thought was going on inside his head. It was just,
But we can't deny the fact that those thoughts were fed and fueled by external sources.
Yes, absolutely.
The question I have is, if we're going to ignore him and not use his name and just isolate ourselves and not give him the satisfaction of being on the receiving end of our anger or outrage or our demands for justice, etc., wouldn't it be great if we could do the same thing with Trump?
I always thought to myself, if Trump ever went to a rally or something like that, because he's always using cameras of being fake media and all that sort of. I would love it, if he just rocked up to a rally and there were no cameras.
Yeah.
None. Maybe a Fox News one, because you expect that, but no other cameras. Where's he going to go? What's he going to do? Start ignoring him.
Well, this is, I mean, in some ways I jest, but in other ways, it's not hard. It's not hard to draw, and whilst it's not necessarily, data science in the strictest sense, it's not hard to draw some lines based on what the perpetrator wrote in his manifesto, that he has clearly been influenced by the thoughts and the communication and the attitudes that have been, demonstrated from the President of the United States. And so he was very clear about that. And I do think, that if we're talking about these principles of we just won't tolerate, we just won't tolerate racism, we just won't tolerate anti-immigration, we just won't tolerate, a hatred of any one person over another, then I'm like, okay, let's just apply that rule in a blanket fashion and maybe it will all be okay.
Yeah. I would love them. Back to the live streaming thing. I just think they should just get rid of it completely. As you said, no one should have live streaming. I don't want to see someone live streaming their life. Who cares? But I do think there should be situations for professionals and for registered so-and-sos that they can do that sort of thing for channel purposes or whatnot. But I think that should absolutely be taken away from everybody.
Yeah.
There's no need. There's absolutely no need for it. We see too much of people anyway. I've seen enough. I've seen enough of the world. Oh my word. Way too much.
How will it change you? How has it changed you?
How has it changed me? Oh, that's a good question. It certainly made me more mindful of some of the things that I say, to a point, without editing myself too much in normal life. It's made me... I've always been sort of somebody who thinks about things deeply. I like to be the last person to speak. I listen to everybody else's opinions and then try and formulate it and try and rationalize everything. That's the sort of person I've always been. Sometimes, though, Uncle Daryl just comes out and says it. And it can be said out of context, or it can be said, I don't always say things right. No one ever does. People always say things wrong from time to time, but it has made me a little bit more...
I'm pretty good most of the time.
You're
I'd
pretty
give
good most of
myself
the
like
time.
a 95 out of 100. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I give you that. But I certainly have been a bit more stoic or whatever about things recently. Just sort of, thinking a bit more. And Facebook, social media is a good example. I haven't leapt on anything. There's been a couple of things where I've had to voice something because it's like, that's ridiculous. But thinking about it before saying it, and in the grand scheme of things, I just want to try and understand more locally, as you said. Like, I want to understand more of our mixed cultures in a local sense, rather than thinking I've got to go overseas and do all this sort of stuff. I still want to go overseas and see things, sure. But, there's from your neighbours to, other people's mosques or temples or whatever you want to call them.
Can I make it even simpler?
Go.
Like the Korean or Vietnamese or Thai family that run your local dairy, the people who own or run your local gas station.
Yeah.
Engage in conversation.
Stereotyping a bit there, aren't you?
But don't we? This is the thing, right?
But
this is the thing, because the reality is that so much of our multiculturalism is actually in front of us day in, day out, every day. And so engage. Make the point of engaging with the human being that's taking your FPOS payment, or, that's what I think is where we should start. Just remembering that we're all actually human beings before anything else.
And how are you going to change? How has this affected you? What's Tash going to change? Not that you weren't perfect beforehand, but how are things going to change for you?
There's some interesting things. I had a really interesting conversation with my mother. So in our family lineage, going back a couple of greats, there's a grandmother who was from Mumbai, India. And so in our family, we are part Indian.
Mm-hmm.
And it is something that my grandfather used to joke about and acknowledge only in a funny way, where he would do a really terrible Punjabi accent and ask Mr. Patel, who owned the local fish and chip shop, for a discount because we're cousins after all. And I remember from a really young age being embarrassed about that and not knowing how to have that conversation or to change that. And I remember also it being very kind of dismissive, that, oh yeah, it's there, but I mean, it was generations ago, it doesn't make a difference. And I think I've always been proud of the fragments of, I'm Scottish and Irish and a little bit Welsh and whatever, but I've always been really proud of those fragments and wanted to learn more and know more. And